In 2015, the 196 nations of the planet Earth agreed to do their best to keep global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees Celsius. And that's from a pre-industrial baseline. This was at the 21st annual session of the Conference of the Parties, also known as COP21, and the agreement reached has, of course, become known as the Paris Agreement. What's more, these nations agreed to also pursue efforts to limit temperature rise to just 1.5 degrees Celsius. Sounds good, right? Well, the problem is that global temperature has already risen by 2/3 of that amount, 1 degree Celsius, from pre-industrial levels. What's more and worse, the United States, which is second only to China in terms of greenhouse gas emissions at the moment, has since withdrawn from the Paris Agreement, and the rest of the nations involved have only promised to reduce emissions, as the Paris Agreement has no enforcement mechanism. And less than 2 years after the COP21, the IPCC, and that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change appointed by the United Nations to study the climate crisis, released a special report on global climate warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius that suggests that a 1.5 degree increase could happen in as little as 11 years. And that's just 10 years from the time that I'm recording this. And almost certainly within 20 years if major cuts in global greenhouse emissions were not made immediately. Since we are not yet taking the necessary steps to make these cuts, a 1.5 degree rise seems inevitable soon, and 2 degrees likely. Unfortunately, as the IPCC report made clear, even a 1.5 degree rise will have profound global consequences, and a 2 degree rise will obviously be still worse. But what sort of consequences would we be facing if we failed to stop global temperature at 2 degrees, which now seems entirely possible, if not in fact likely? That's the question taken up by David Wallace Wells in his July 2017 New York Magazine article entitled The Uninhabitable Earth. Wallace Wells, incidentally, has subsequently written a book with the same title and published a follow-up article entitled We're Getting a Clearer Picture of the Climate Future, and it's not as bad as we once thought. Anyhow, in the 2017 article, it nicely lays out the consequences of climate change if we do not act quickly and decisively. Wallace Wells explains. The article is the result of dozens of interviews and exchanges with climatologists and researchers in related fields, and reflects hundreds of scientific papers on the subject of climate change. What follows is not a series of predictions of what will happen. That will be determined, in large part, by much less certain science of human response. Instead, it is a portrait of our best understanding of where the planet is heading, absent aggressive action. It is unlikely that all of these warming scenarios will be fully realized, largely because of the devastation along the way will hopefully shake us out of our complacency. But those scenarios, and not the present climate, are the baseline. In fact, they are our schedule. While many authors focus on the impact of 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius of global temperature rise, Wallace Wells rightly notes that such a small rise in temperature is a best case, and at this point probably unlikely scenario, especially as human activity has already warmed the Earth by 1 degree Celsius. With this in mind, Wallace Wells takes up the question of what the Earth and our lives would be like with a 2 to 4 degree Celsius rise, which is where we are headed if we do not act, and act quickly. The uninhabitable Earth generated quite a bit of controversy, as many people, including some climate scientists, thought that he was being too alarmist. However, as Wallace Wells makes clear in the above quote, he is portraying just one possible future. He notes that it is unlikely that all of this will happen, as humanity will at some point hopefully wake up and act. However, if we do not, Wallace Wells paints a picture of what business as usual will take us to. Incidentally, because a number of individuals have questioned the scenarios that he's laid out, Wallace Wells also created an annotated version of this article where he notes and responds to the objections. So a few questions for thought. Is Wallace Wells too alarmist? While his objective seems to be to startle us into action by laying out what the future could hold if we do nothing, does he risk doing just the opposite by incapacitating us with fear? There's certainly quite a bit of doom and gloom in the article. Expressed another way, how did you feel, or what did you want to do after putting down the article? Did you feel prompted to action, or simply prompted to inaction and wanted to sit down and cry? Regarding the above question, does taking an alarmist tack risk alienating certain readers? Climate change deniers and skeptics frequently refer to people who are trying to alert us to the dangers of the climate crisis as climate change alarmists, as they characterize them as trying to frighten us into action. As an obvious alarmist in this sense, Wallace Wells fits into this category that some people might summarily dismiss. What do you make of that fact? Wallace Wells focused on a number of specific consequences of climate change, including heat death, end of food, climate plagues, unbreathable air, perpetual war, permanent economic collapse, poisoned oceans, and so forth. Which did you find of these the most compelling and worrisome, and why? A final thought. Some people might be quick to dismiss Wallace Wells as he is looking forward to an uncertain future. However, a quick look to the recent past makes it hard to dismiss Wallace Wells as simply alarmist. At the close of 2019, journalists Sarah Ruse Grossman and Linda O'Connor published an article on 7 numbers that show how dire climate change got during this decade, and that decade meaning the 20-teens. Allow me to end by repeating these 7 things. 1, the past 5 years were the hottest ever recorded on the planet. 2, 4 of the 5 largest wildfires in California's history happened this decade. 3, 6 Category 5 hurricanes tore through the Atlantic region in the past 4 years. 4, Arctic sea ice cover has dropped about 13% this decade. Floods with a 0.1 chance of happening, and 0.1 meaning 1 in 1,000 chance of happening, in any given year became a frequent occurrence. 6, there were more than $100 billion climate disasters, double from the decade before. And 7, and last, meanwhile, we pumped a record 40.5 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the air, and that was just in 2019.